This next case takes us to Jacksonville, Florida, and it's here that 19-year-old Nikia Chanel Kilpatrick was living her young life. She was a single mother, raising two small children on her own, and despite how young she was, Nikia had things pretty well together. People who knew her said she was basically supermom. She had her own place, she provided for her kids, and she was doing it all without any outside help. 19 years old, and already running her household with strength and love. It was New Year's Day, January 1st, 2003, when her family began to feel that something wasn't right. They realized no one had heard from Nikia for a little while. Not a phone call, not even a quick message. And that just wasn't like her. Nikia was someone who stayed in touch with her family every day. Even if it was something small, like a short text or a quick call, she always made time. She was dependable like that. So when New Year's Day rolled around and not one person in her family received a Happy New Year text from her, that's when the alarms really started to go off. It didn't sit right with them at all. Something about it just felt wrong. That night, around 10 p.m., her family decided to drive to her home to check in. They needed to see her for themselves. They couldn't just ignore the feeling. When they got there, the house was dark and still. No lights on, no movement inside. It looked quiet, too quiet. It was eerie, like something wasn't just wrong. It felt like something had already happened. Her parents walked up to the front door and knocked. Then they waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no baby cries. They knocked again, louder this time. Still silent. They tried calling out to her, even knocked on the windows, hoping that if she was inside, she'd hear them. But there was no response. The noise outside eventually drew attention from someone else, Nikia's neighbor. She wasn't just any neighbor either. She was actually really close to Nikia, a young woman around the same age, someone who spent time with her almost daily. They were friends. So when she came outside and saw Nikia's family standing there, the worry on their faces, she told them something that made their hearts sink even further. She said she hadn't seen or heard from Nikia in several days either. Now they were all gathered outside in the dark, piecing things together. Try to remember the last time they spoke to her, when anyone had last actually seen her, and the sense of urgency kept growing. And then suddenly, they heard something, a noise from inside the house. It came from a direction of the living room. They rushed to the window, the one that looked in on that part of the house. And what they saw left them frozen in place. Nikia's oldest child, still just a toddler, was standing there on the other side of the glass. He was banging on the window, clearly upset. His little hands pressed against the glass, his face distressed. He was alone, and something was terribly wrong. So they run over to the window, and like the blinds are down, but there are a few gaps between them, right? So the neighbor starts trying to peek through the little slits, and she sees that the place is a mess inside. And that just confirmed to them that something was definitely wrong here. Like the fact that Nikia wasn't answering the door, one of the kids was inside, and now the apartment was trashed. They knew something was off. So they did the only thing they could think of. They kicked the door in, just booted it in. And as soon as they did, this horrible smell came wafting out of the house. The older toddler came running over to his grandparents as soon as they broke in, and not long after that, the 11-month-old baby came crawling out of one of the rooms, just crawling around on his own, like just out there by himself. They're calling out for Nikia, but there's nothing. She's not answering. She's not anywhere to be seen. Just these two little kids wandering around the apartment alone. So her parents start running around the place, shouting her name, checking every room, and then they get to the hallway. And that's where they found what they'd been dreading. That awful smell? It was their daughter, Nikia's decomposing body, lying right there in the hallway. And even worse, it was clear that she'd been violently murdered. She still had a telephone cord wrapped around her neck in a slip knot. Her ankles were tied, her wrists were tied, and she had cuts and bruises all over her, like she'd definitely fought back. And she was 6 months pregnant when this happened. The baby died with her. From the smell alone, it was obvious that she'd been dead for at least a few days, and that her two kids had just been left there in the apartment with her body the whole time. Nikia's parents just grabbed the kids and ran out of the house with them and called the police straight away. And that's when the murder investigation officially started. When police got to the crime scene, One of the first things they noticed during the initial search was that the kitchen was a total mess, like the whole apartment was messy. Yeah, but the kitchen was something else. But it wasn't messy like someone had ransacked it or anything. It was just like food everywhere, cereal boxes tipped over, empty wrappers all across the floor. And it turns out that was because Nikia's kids had been trying to feed themselves. They were literally scavenging for food, rummaging through the kitchen, because they'd been locked in that apartment alone with their mother's dead body for days. They were just trying to survive. And honestly, it's heartbreaking to think about how scared and confused those kids must have been, especially the older one. I don't know exactly how old he was, but he was a toddler, old enough to kind of understand that something was really wrong, that his mom wasn't moving. It's just devastating. Police actually believed that if they hadn't gotten to that house when they did, if the kids hadn't been found that night, there was a real chance they could have died too. Starved to death right there in that house, especially the baby. Thankfully, they were rescued just in time, and they're both alive and doing well now. But back to the crime scene. So another thing that stood out to police was that there were no signs of forced entry. Like none. And remember, the door was locked. Her family had to literally kick it in to get inside. So what did that mean? Did Nikia know her killer and let them in willingly? Did they steal her key and lock the door on their way out? None of it really added up. And aside from that, there just wasn't much evidence. The killer didn't leave anything behind. Nothing obvious, nothing dropped, nothing helpful. So Nikia Kilpatrick's body was sent off for an autopsy, and it was found that she had been raped during the attack, which meant that they were able to collect a semen sample from her attacker. And that was a big deal because now they had DNA to test. So now if they had any suspects, they could run this DNA and see if it matched. Even better would be if they could run the sample through the national system and get an immediate hit. But they tried and nothing. No match in the system. So it looked like this guy had never been caught for anything before. Either it was his first crime, or he just never had his DNA taken. So this was pretty frustrating, because if the killer had committed a crime before, their DNA would have popped up immediately and police could have had a suspect that same day. But nope, that wasn't the case. That being said, the DNA sample was still going to be useful, hopefully, later on in the investigation, because if they did get any suspects, they could test it. But since they couldn't go down that route just yet, police decided to start interviewing. They began talking to literally anyone and everyone, Nikia's friends, family, neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard something. But nope, nothing. Nobody had anything helpful to share. It was like within just the first day of this investigation, they were already at a dead end. No leads, no idea where to go next, just completely stuck. But then, about a week into the investigation, police got hit with another murder case. And this one was almost identical to Nikia's. It was another young woman, found strangled to death in her own apartment. The cord was still tied around her neck when she was found. And this second victim, she was actually discovered by her own boyfriend. His name was Rashid. He'd been out all day and came back home around midnight. But when he got there, he realized he didn't have his key. The door was locked from the inside. His girlfriend had locked it, and now he couldn't get in. So he's banging on the door, trying to wake her up, but there's no answer. No sound at all. So he thinks, what else can I do? And he ends up removing one of the windows, basically breaking into his own house. And once he got inside, that's when he found her dead, murdered with the cord still wrapped around her neck. Her wrists tied, her ankles tied, and she was naked from the waist down. This second victim's name was Shawanda Denise McAllister. She was 20 years old, so just a year older than Nikia. And honestly, these two victims had almost the exact same profile. Both were young black women living in Jacksonville with really similar lifestyles. They actually lived only about a mile apart from each other, so really close geographically. I don't know a whole lot about Shawanda, but what I do know is that she was a medical student and also working as a nursing assistant at the same time. She was super intelligent, super dedicated, and she had big dreams of moving up in the medical field. But sadly, that's all I really know about her. So police start searching the crime scene, and very quickly they find a used condom, just lying a few feet away from Shawanda's body. So presumably, that's what her attacker used. And honestly, that was one of the only two pieces of evidence they found in the whole house. The second thing was an ATM receipt showing that Shawanda had gone and taken out about $200 at 8:30 p.m. that night, the same night she was killed. That was all the evidence they had. So Shawanda's body was sent off for autopsy, and the results, again, were almost identical to Nikia's. She had been bound, strangled to death with a cord, and raped before she was killed. And what's even more heartbreaking, Shawanda was also pregnant at the time of her murder. And just like with Nikia, the baby died too. So now police are thinking, well, does this mean something? That both of these victims were pregnant? Was that a reason why they were specifically targeted? But the biggest thing that told police that these two murders were connected, aside from the nearly identical victim profiles and MOs, was one really specific detail. Both of these women had been strangled with a cord that had the exact same kind of slip knot. And this wasn't a common knot. It was a very particular type of slip knot that not many people would even know how to tie. So now, police knew they were dealing with one person, a double murderer. They managed to take a DNA swab from Shawanda's body and sent it off for testing. Again, no match came up on the system. But what they did get was a match to the DNA sample taken from Nikia's body. So now they knew, whoever did this, raped and killed both women. Same man, same killer. But this was a terrifying realization for police. If they were looking for a double murderer, what's stopping him from becoming a triple murderer? A serial killer? They knew they had to act fast before he killed again, so they threw everything they had into this case. Looking specifically at Shawanda's case, there was one obvious suspect, Rashid, her boyfriend. He was the one who found her body, the one who admitted to breaking into the house to find her. Naturally, police zeroed in on him. They wondered, what if Rashid also knew Nikia? What if he had been cheating on Shawanda with her? That would explain the same man's DNA in both women. Because technically, there's no way to immediately prove that the DNA found was from rape. It could have been from consensual sex. Maybe both women had willingly slept with the same man and then were murdered afterward. It doesn't automatically mean the rape was connected to the murder. It's rare, like 99% of the time, if DNA is found in a case like this, it means sexual assault. But technically, it could have been different. And Rashid was 20 years old, just a year older than Nikia, and lived only a mile away from her. So there's a decent chance they could have known each other. Maybe they went to school together or crossed paths somewhere. So to the police, this theory actually sounded kind of plausible. So police start questioning Rashid, and he had one hell of a story to tell about what happened leading up to Shawanda's murder. Rashid said that he had been out for most of the day, and when he came back home to the apartment, as he was walking up to the door, he could already hear music blasting from inside. Like, really loud, which was weird because Shawanda never usually played music like that. And as he's getting closer, he also hears a man's voice coming from inside the apartment. So now he's already suspicious. He knocks on the door. Apparently, he didn't have his key on him. Again, like, does this man ever carry his key? Anyway, Shawanda answers the door, but she only opens it just a crack, like barely at all. She's clearly trying to keep him out. Rashid can hear everything. The music, the man's voice, and he immediately starts freaking out, asking, "Who's in there? What's going on? I can hear someone." And Shawanda just keeps saying, "It's nothing, don't worry about it. Just go. I'll explain everything later. Just go." She's really trying to get rid of him, clearly doesn't want him coming inside. But Rashid says, "I need my work uniform. It's in the house." And Shawanda's like, "Okay, I'll get it for you." So she shuts the door again, locks it, and a minute later, she dumps his clothes outside and locks the door again. She goes back inside, where the loud music's still blasting, and that mystery guy is still in there. So now Rashid's just standing outside, heartbroken, thinking he just caught his pregnant girlfriend cheating on him. He said he was shouting through the door like, "How could you do this to me? We were family. You're pregnant with my baby. How could you do this?" But in the end, he just had to leave. He didn't want to miss work, and clearly, she wasn't going to let him in. So he left completely confused, no idea who the guy inside was because he never saw him. Shawanda barely opened the door. All he had to go off of was the sound of the man's voice. And Rashid told police it sounded like an older black man, But that's all he could say. That's all he had. So police are listening to Rashid's story thinking, oh, how convenient. The day Shawanda is murdered, she just happens to be in the company of another man. Like, Rashid finds out his pregnant girlfriend is cheating on him, and then later that same day, she's found dead, and somehow it's another guy's fault? Yeah, it all just seemed a little too convenient. It felt like a potential cover-up. So police ask Rashid if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test. He agrees, and he passes. It seemed like he was telling the truth. If you believe polygraphs, that is. I mean, we don't usually, but he passed. And since polygraph tests aren't exactly reliable, police decided to be thorough and test Rashid's DNA against the samples found at both crime scenes. They sent it off for testing, and the results come back. It's not a match. Rashid isn't the killer. So now police are back to square one. No suspects, no leads, nothing. They've got to start over. So they go and question people around Shawanda's neighborhood, just to see if anyone saw or heard anything useful. A few neighbors mentioned seeing Shawanda getting in and out of taxis that day. She didn't drive, so taxis were her main mode of transport. It wasn't unusual. Neighbors were used to seeing her do this all the time. But then one neighbor told police they saw a man leaving Shawanda's apartment and getting into a taxi, and this was at around 11 p.m. At the time, the neighbor just assumed it was Rashid. I mean, who else would it be? But now that we know Rashid wasn't there, and 11 p.m. is around the time Shawanda was murdered, it looks like that witness saw the killer leaving the scene. So if it wasn't Rashid, then who was it? Right now, police have a double murderer on the loose. But what if this wasn't just two victims? What if Nikia and Shawanda weren't the only ones? What if there were more bodies out there? What if they already had a serial killer on their hands? At this point, they just didn't know. So this led police to start digging through a bunch of old, unsolved disappearances and murder cases, specifically ones involving young women who were around the same age and matched the general description of Nikia and Shawanda. They were looking for any kind of pattern, anything that might link another case to these two. And pretty quickly, they came across the unsolved murder of an 18-year-old girl named Nicole Williams, and this one immediately caught their attention. Nicole had been found dead less than 2 weeks before Nikia, so the timeline already seemed to line up. The way she was found was strange. Her body had been wrapped up in a blue blanket and just dumped by the side of the road somewhere. And this blanket wasn't just any kind of blanket. It looked like one of those decorative hotel blankets. You know, the ones they fold up and lay across the foot of the bed that aren't actually meant to be used for warmth? Yeah, it was one of those. So police started thinking, maybe Nicole was killed in a hotel or motel room, and then her killer used the blanket from the room to wrap her up and dump her. But the thing that really connected Nicole's case to the others was DNA. Nicole had also been raped by her attacker, and when they tested the DNA found on her body, there was no match on the system, but there was a match to the DNA found in Nikia and Shawanda's cases. So that confirmed it. Police were officially dealing with a serial killer. Nicole Williams was one of his victims. That made at least 3 women, and who knows how many more there might be. And actually, if you count the unborn babies of Nikia and Shawanda, since both women were planning to carry their pregnancies to term and raise their children, that technically brings the death toll to 5. 3 women and 2 babies, all killed by this one man, and all within just over a month. 5 lives lost in barely more than 4 weeks. And it wouldn't be long before police were presented with another victim. On February 5th, 2003, police got a call from some construction workers. They had shown up to the site that morning and could hear dogs barking in the distance, but didn't really think much of it. But as the day went on, the dogs just kept barking, nonstop, and the workers started to wonder, what are they barking at? What's going on? So one of the workers decides to go check it out. He follows the sound of the barking until he finds the dogs. They were all gathered around something on the ground, just barking like crazy. When the worker got closer, it spooked the dogs, and they scattered. And that's when he saw what they were barking at. A dead body. He called the police immediately, and they got there as fast as they could. They started searching the area for clues, but what they didn't expect was to find another body, just a few feet away from the first one. And both of these victims had very similar profiles. They were both young black women. and both had clearly been strangled to death. Both had been raped, and it looked like their hands and feet had been tied at some point. And honestly, just from looking at the scene, police could already tell their serial killer had struck again. These two victims were identified as 17-year-old Giovanna Tarika Jefferson and 18-year-old Surita and Cohen. So now the death toll was up to 5 women, or 7 if you're including the unborn babies from the earlier victims. After discovering these latest 2 victims, police issued a public warning. They told everyone, especially young black women, to be on high alert. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't go out at night until they found who was doing this. As they started looking deeper into the 2 new cases, they found out that Giovanna, the younger one, had actually been missing for quite a while, over 2 weeks. They believe she was murdered the very night she disappeared, which was January 20th, and then eventually discovered on February 5th. The last time anyone saw Giovanna alive was when she went to a party on January 20th. She had a great time, all her friends are there, and she called a taxi to go home. The last time she was seen was getting into that taxi. She never made it home, so whatever happened to her happened on the way back. Of course, her family were at home waiting for her to come back that night, and when she wasn't showing up, her aunt started getting really worried. She called Giovanna's phone, and someone picked up, but it wasn't Giovanna on the other end. It was an older man. This man just said that Giovanna would be home soon. So her aunt's like, okay, well, who are you? And the only name he gave was D, and then he hung up. Her family didn't hear anything after that. Not a call, not a message, until February 5th, when they got the news that Giovanna's body had been found. And like I said, police believe that she was murdered the same night as the party, and that her body had been left there at the construction site, decomposing for weeks. As for the second victim, Surita, police believed she was murdered about 10 days after Giovanna. The 2 attacks weren't at the same time, but police think the killer decided to dump both bodies in the same place. Probably because no one had found Giovanna's yet, so the killer figured it was a safe dump site. Now, police are going back over all of these cases, trying to find common threads, anything that might link them. And they notice something that keeps popping up: taxis. A lot of these girls were seen getting into taxis before they went missing. So they start talking to witnesses, asking if anyone remembers which taxi company the girls were using. And every single witness gave the same name, Gator City Taxis. Police go down to the Gator City Taxi rank to start asking questions. They learn that it's a pretty small operation, just a few drivers working most nights. But what stood out was that one of the drivers was brand new. In fact, his very first day on the job was the exact same day that Shawanda was murdered. Interesting. This new driver's name? Paul Duraso. And as soon as police heard that last name, Duraso, they thought back to that call Giovanna's aunt had answered. The man had only said his name was could he have been Paul Duraso? At this point, police start digging into Paul Duraso's background because now he's looking like a pretty solid suspect. So he was originally born in Texas on August 11th, 1970. He was raised by a single mother because his father left pretty much as soon as he was born, and after that, he was never in Paul's life. Not even like financially. That man was as good as dead to Paul. After the split, Paul and his mom moved to LA, so he never really grew up in Texas at all. But, well, he never really grew up in LA either because him and his mom just moved all over California. He was never in the same place for longer than a year. And this meant Paul didn't have much stability in his childhood, like at all. He was never at the same school for too long, never had a real hometown, really. He never had a consistent group of friends. Everything was just always getting shuffled and rearranged in his life. The only consistent thing he had was his mother, which would have been fine, but because she was a single mom, she had to work crazy hours just to support the 2 of them. So she wasn't around much, and he didn't really have anyone else. Paul Duraso had a very lonely and isolated childhood. When he got older, his first job was at age 18. He became a security guard. And honestly, it kind of suited him because he was a really big guy. Like he was 6'6". Later in life, he got kind of skinny, but when he was younger, he was hitting the gym a lot. He was pretty muscular. Not like massive, but enough to be kind of scary. You know, if your security guard is 6'6" and muscly, I'm not starting anything. I'm walking away. Paul kind of liked this job, but it wasn't very exciting for him. Honestly, his whole life wasn't very exciting. He didn't really have any friends. He didn't have a girlfriend. So to entertain himself, Paul Duriso started committing crimes. Because, yeah, that's a great idea when you're bored, isn't it? It's not. Just to clarify, it's a terrible idea. Don't do that. Play a game or something. He started carrying guns around everywhere, and he got caught for it because he wasn't very subtle. Not that you should ever carry a gun, but he would literally carry it in his hand. Police actually let him off with a warning the first time. I think they might have confiscated the gun, but he didn't get any jail time or anything. No charges, I don't think. And then, less than a month later, he was arrested again for the exact same thing, concealment of a firearm. And again, they let him off with a warning. I don't know why they didn't actually do anything about this guy, but yeah, another warning. And I think those two close calls kind of shook him up. Like, scared him just enough that he decided to get his life together. He decided he was going to join the army. This was supposed to be like a fresh start for him. He was going to move away with the army, have a second chance at life, and just be a good citizen. Yeah. So he goes off to Germany. He's stationed over there, and honestly, everything's going really well. He's actually really enjoying the army, and while he's out there, he meets a woman. This woman's name was Natoka Span, and the two of them hit it off straight away, like they got on really, really well, like a house on fire. And within a couple of years, they were married. Once they got married, the army allowed them to move to a more stable base. They moved to Georgia together, got a house on a base, and started a family. They had 2 daughters, and everything seemed great. Everyone was really happy. This was exactly what they wanted. Paul and his wife were in love. There were no problems. Everything was perfect. But then Paul decided to make it not perfect. He got bored. And so he did the only thing this man seemed to do when he was bored: commit crimes. Only this time, it was a million times worse than anything he'd done before. Before, it was just carrying around guns, more like a rebellion thing for him. But now he was actually becoming something else, something sinister, like a cold-blooded criminal. In 1997, Paul Duriso committed his first violent crime, as far as we know anyway. This is the first one that's ever been on record, when he kidnapped and raped a young girl. But Paul was actually never found guilty of that attack because police just didn't have enough evidence to take it to trial. They were so sure he'd done it, like there was no doubt in their minds. But without the physical evidence, they just couldn't make anything stick. So, he was never actually charged. It never went on his record. But obviously, after the accusations and everything surrounding it, he was dishonorably discharged from the army. So now he's just sitting at home, unemployed, bored, and yeah, you can kind of guess where this is going. Paul starts committing crimes left, right, and center. Robbery, theft, burglary, sexual battery. He's even talking to underage girls, like just everything awful that he could be doing, he was doing. And somehow, every single time, he would get away with it. Like, sometimes he'd get caught, sometimes not. But even when he was caught, the charges would get dropped or there just wouldn't be enough evidence to stick. It was like crime followed him everywhere he went, but he never faced any real consequences. And because of that, he was getting bolder. He was becoming more arrogant, and his crimes were getting worse. Obviously, this was putting a huge strain on his family. His wife wanted to raise their 2 daughters in a safe, stable, loving home, and Paul was making that impossible. There were cops showing up at the house all the time. Paul was getting arrested like this was no environment for 2 little girls. So in an attempt to turn things around and create a better life, Paul's wife suggested they move back to her hometown, Jacksonville, Florida. They could live near her parents, get some support, and just try again. It was supposed to be a second chance for their marriage, for their family, for everything. So Paul agreed. The family packed up and moved to Jacksonville. But of course, nothing changed. Paul was still the exact same horrible man, just in a different place now. He was still out committing crimes, still acting like a complete nightmare. And now he'd started disrespecting and abusing his wife. Verbally, emotionally, he'd scream at her, shout at her face, and sometimes even get violent. He was also super unfaithful. Paul Duriso had multiple affairs. He'd go out to bars, flirt with other women, sleep around. And the thing is, I think his wife knew. I think she knew what he was doing, But she was so focused on keeping their family together and creating a happy, stable home for their daughters that she was kind of willing to put up with it. Like, she was determined to make things work, no matter how horrible he was becoming. And Paul was getting worse. Every month, every year, he just kept doing worse and worse things. And what makes it even more disturbing is that at the start of their relationship, according to everything I've read, he actually seemed like a decent guy. Or at least he was putting on an act and pretending to be one. It wasn't like this in the beginning. It just slowly escalated. And the more she tried to hold the family together, the more she was putting up with. She didn't want to leave him because she didn't want the kids to grow up without a dad. But then you find out that this man, who has 2 daughters of his own, was out there flirting with girls as young as 13 and 14. Like actual children. That is sick. And the worst part is, he wasn't even being subtle about it. Paul Duraso was getting a reputation around town. People were calling him a creep, a pedophile, a predator. And because of that, people started pulling away from him. No one wanted anything to do with him. He didn't have friends anymore. People were avoiding him. And just like when he was a kid, once again, Paul found himself isolated. And with that isolation, with that anger building up inside him, Paul started taking more and more of it out on his wife. The violence she was going through by this point, it wasn't just shouting anymore. It had escalated to slaps during arguments, him pushing her around, shoving her out of the way, stuff like that. And bit by bit, it kept getting worse until one day, things took a terrifying turn. Paul grabbed her by the throat and shoved her up against a wall. He choked her. This was the worst it had ever been, and she was terrified that it was only going to keep getting worse from here. That if she didn't do something now, next time he really might kill her. So in the year 2000, she decided to take action. She filed a court order against him. And honestly, that changed things, at least for a while. Paul had never really been challenged before. He'd gotten away with so much for so long. Cheating, stealing, assault, everything. And now suddenly the courts were involved. That scared him. It was the first time he really saw consequences, and for a moment, it forced him to straighten up. He started treating her better, at least on the surface. But of course, that didn't last. Not even a year later, the cycle started all over again. Paul snapped again, and this time, it was even worse than before. He grabbed her by the throat, both hands this time, and slammed her up against the wall. He held her there until she was nearly unconscious. And he did all this in front of their children. While he had her pinned against the wall, he was screaming at her that he was going to kill her. Their kids were watching, crying, begging him to stop. But he didn't care. He was fully gone. So again, she went to the courts. She filed for another protection order. But weirdly enough, she wouldn't end up needing it. Because right around that same time, Paul Duraso was finally about to be locked up for the very first time in his life. Just a month or 2 after that second assault, he was charged with the rape of a young woman. Finally, it looked like something might stick. And what did he get? 1 month. He was sentenced to just 1 month in prison for rape. This man had a long, growing record of serious crimes. He was clearly escalating. And yet somehow, the system gave him 30 days. So yeah, off he went. He served those 30 days, and when he got out, he walked straight back in the same house, the same family, the same cycle. And what did they do? They tried again. They gave it, what, a fresh start for the 100th time? Like somehow this would be the moment that changed everything. That this time he'd finally get it right. Please, if you're ever in a situation like this, never give someone this many chances. I promise you, people like this rarely ever change. Just leave, as soon as you can, because no one can fix someone like this. But anyway, he's back. And of course, it didn't take long for him to start being abusive again. This time, though, his wife didn't bother with another court order. She went straight to the police. She told them everything. All the times he'd abused her, all the times he'd put his hands on her, choked her, threatened her life. She finally laid it all out, and Paul was charged with domestic violence. What did he get? 48 days in prison. That's it. 48 days for choking his wife until she almost blacked out, threatening to kill her in front of their kids for years of abuse. Just 48 days. And then when he got out, yep, he went straight back to living with his wife and kids again, like nothing had happened. And that pretty much brings us right up to date in the timeline of this whole case. because now it's January 2003 and Paul Duraso has just started working at Gator City Taxi Company. This job gave him so much freedom, and he took full advantage of it. He was picking up new women every single day, and almost every time a woman got in his car, he'd try to flirt with her. And sometimes it actually worked, because according to some of these women, Paul Duraso was really charming. He knew how to talk. He knew exactly what to say to get them to trust him, or like him, or feel safe around him. So yeah, it worked. He ended up starting affairs and casual relationships, going on dates with all these different women. And eventually, his wife found out about it. She finally realized just how much he was cheating on her, and that was it. That was the final straw. She packed up, took the kids, and left. So now Paul was all alone. And, well, free to meet even more women, I guess. So yeah, back to the timeline of the investigation. Police had gone down to the taxi rank to gather more info, and that's when they discovered that it was Paul Duraso who had picked up both Giovanna Jefferson and Sharita Cohen on the nights they each disappeared. Right away, they tracked him down and arrested him. They brought him into the police station for questioning, but he was cool as a cucumber. Seriously, he showed no emotion at all, just sat there calmly, giving no comment to everything. And police were starting to feel a bit nervous, because if he wasn't going to talk, then how were they supposed to get any kind of evidence out of him? They'd really hoped he'd slip up or say something they could use, but he wasn't saying anything. So now they had to start thinking about other ways to get evidence against Paul Duraso. I mean, they already had that DNA sample, and obviously that would be the strongest piece of evidence if it came back as a match to the crime scenes. That would be ideal. But this was 2003, and back then, DNA testing took forever. Like months. I mean, I don't know exactly, I wasn't a scientist in 2003, but the point is, it was going to take a while. So while they waited on that DNA result, police had to look for other things they could use. One of the things they did was pull up the phone records, both Giovanna's and Sharita's, from the nights they went missing. And then they compared those with Paul Duraso's phone records. You know, the ones that show your phone's location. And guess what? It turned out that both women were in the exact same location as Paul Duraso on the nights they were murdered. Like, same place, same time. And that cannot be a coincidence. There's just no way he just happened to be around when both of those women were killed. Oh, and another piece of evidence. Remember how I mentioned right at the beginning of this investigation that the cords used to strangle these women were tied using a specific kind of slip knot? And how that slip knot was pretty uncommon. Well, turns out that exact kind of slip knot is one they actually teach you in the Army. And who was in the Army? Paul Duraso. Police also searched Paul's car, and in the boot, they found a bunch of tiny blue fibers. These fibers matched the blanket that Nicole Williams was wrapped in when her body was dumped by the side of the road. So now the evidence is stacking up and connecting Paul Duraso to pretty much all of the murders. They also found evidence linking him to Shawanda McAllister's case. Remember that ATM receipt they found in her apartment? The one showing she took out cash around 8:30 p.m.? Well, police went to that ATM and pulled the surveillance footage, and sure enough, there's Shawanda at 8:30 p.m. pulling up in a Gator City taxi. She gets out, takes cash from the ATM, and then gets back into the taxi, which then drives away. And then finally, after gathering all that evidence, the DNA test results came back, and it was a match. Paul Duraso's DNA was found at, I think, every single one of the crime scenes, with every single victim. That confirmed it. He was their serial killer. So in June of 2003, Paul Duraso was officially charged with 5 counts of murder and 2 counts of child abuse for leaving Nikia's 2 young kids locked inside the house with her dead body. I've read that thankfully, those 2 children, now that they're all grown up, don't remember anything about that night. And I guess that's a small silver lining. They were way too young to understand what was happening. They don't remember being left in the house. They don't remember seeing their mother like that. So yeah, they had their guy. They had their killer. But that didn't mean the investigation was over. Because like I said, okay, he's already a confirmed serial killer, but how do they know he's done killing? How do they know they found all of his victims? There could still be more out there. More women, more bodies, more lives destroyed by this man. And sure enough, the deeper they dug, the more they found. One of the victims they uncovered was from back when Paul Duraso was still stationed in Georgia with the Army, during what should have been one of the happiest times in his life. He had just gotten married. He had just become a dad to two beautiful baby girls. And meanwhile, he's sneaking out, murdering women in cold blood, and his wife had no idea. This particular victim was 26-year-old Tracy Habersham. She was last seen leaving a party in 1997. 2 days later, her naked body was discovered. She'd been raped, bound, and strangled. The exact same hallmarks of a Paul Duraso murder. Back when she was found, they'd managed to retrieve DNA, but it hadn't matched anyone in the system. Now that they had Paul's DNA, they tested it, and it was a match. That's how they got him for Tracy's murder. But that still wasn't all. There was another one. In 1999, just 2 years after Tracy's murder, a 24-year-old mother of 3 named Tyresa Mack was found dead inside her own apartment. Just like the others, she had been raped and strangled, and the phone cord used to kill her was still wrapped around her neck when police found her. She also had deep marks on her wrists, indicating that the same cord had been tied there first before being moved to her neck. Her body was covered in injuries, defensive wounds, and the room where she was found, it was trashed, like there'd been a serious struggle. Tyresa had fought hard to stay alive. One of the most disturbing injuries she had was a brutal abrasion across her nose that had completely torn the skin away. And this time, Paul had actually stolen from her. As far as we know, he hadn't done this with the others. But with Tyresa, he stole her ring and the TV from her living room. In fact, some neighbors had even seen him that day, carrying the TV out of the apartment and loading it into a taxi. But at the time, no one thought anything of it. And just like the others, he was caught for this one the same way. The DNA evidence sealed it. So now, Paul Duraso has officially been connected to 7 murders, or 9, if you include the 2 unborn children from Nikia and Shawanda. He was without a doubt one of the most dangerous and cold-blooded men authorities had ever encountered. Because of that, the prosecution announced that they were going to seek the death penalty. And honestly, that felt like the only appropriate punishment for someone like him. But then something strange happened, and I'll admit, this part genuinely confused me. Despite everything he'd done, Paul was only ever tried for one of the murders. Just one, the murder of Tyresa Mack. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. What about all the other victims? What about the DNA evidence? The matching fibers? The slipknot technique? All of that felt pretty solid, right? It wasn't just speculation. This was evidence. But for reasons that weren't clearly explained anywhere, the court ruled that police and prosecutors could only pursue one charge. Just Tyrese's case. And yeah, I don't fully understand it either. I really try to look into why, but no matter how deep I dug, I couldn't find a clear answer. I'm being honest with you here. I just don't know. Some people believe it's because the strongest physical evidence they had in many of the other cases was semen DNA. And as awful as it sounds, Duraso's defense team could argue that the encounters were consensual. We know that's incredibly unlikely, especially considering the violent nature of the attacks. But from a legal standpoint, that kind of argument could introduce enough reasonable doubt to derail a conviction. So maybe that's why they decided to focus all their energy on Tyresa Mack's case, where the evidence was especially strong. Not just the DNA, but the neighbors who saw him, the stolen TV, the condition of the crime scene. It all painted a very clear picture. And although he was only officially charged with that one murder, prosecutors were still allowed to present the other cases as supporting evidence. The jury heard it all. They saw the pattern. They saw the escalation. They knew who this man was. And in the end, they found him guilty. Paul Duraso was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But that wasn't the end of it. In 2007, just a few years later, that death sentence was overturned. I couldn't find out exactly why. Again, no detailed explanations seemed to exist publicly. But the result was that Paul Duraso's sentence was downgraded to life in prison. So now, he sits in a Florida prison, 52 years old, and that's where he'll stay for the rest of his life. In the years that followed the trial, a few of the victims' families filed lawsuits against Gator City Taxis. They argued that the company had failed to properly vet Paul Duraso before hiring him, and in doing so, allowed a serial killer direct access to vulnerable women. I wasn't able to find out how those lawsuits ended, but I do know one thing. Gator City Taxi shut down almost immediately after the case. The company doesn't exist anymore and hasn't for years. And one last thing I want to mention before we close this story. It's not confirmed, so take it for what it is, but there's this theory. A kind of quiet rumor that floats around among those who've followed the case closely. Some people believe Paul Duraso may have killed more women. Not in Florida, not in Georgia, but back in Germany during his early army days. Because at the exact same time he was stationed over there was a sudden string of unsolved murders. Young women, same victim profile, raped, strangled, bodies dumped. And then, just like that, when Paul left Germany, the murders stopped. Coincidence? Maybe. There's no physical evidence tying him to those deaths, nothing solid enough to bring charges. That's why it's technically just a theory. But it's one that's mentioned a lot, one that's never been properly investigated. And a lot of people still believe that if anyone ever really did look into those cases, they might just find something. But as for right now, there's no evidence. That's just a theory.